Dana has an Amazon Prime button she presses like it's a nervous tick. Mara has a sticky note on her monitor that just says, wait, 30 days. Same age, same salary, same apartment complex, 2 buildings apart. And 10 years from now, one of them is going to be shocked by how much money she actually has. And it's probably not who you think. Here's the twist right up front. The responsible one isn't automatically the winner, and the impulsive one isn't automatically the loser. Something else decides this, and it's not willpower. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that something is, and you'll be able to check your own bank account against it tonight. Let's level the playing field, because comparisons like this only mean anything if the start is identical. Dana and Mara are both 29. Both make $58,000 a year, working similar mid-level jobs. Dana's in marketing, Mara's in operations, but the take-home pay after taxes lands within a few $100s of each other. About $3, $650 a month. Both have $3,000 in a savings account. Both have no credit card debt, no student loans left to pay off, and both pay $1.400 a month in rent for near-identical one-bedroom apartments in the same zip code. Neither one has kids. Neither one has a car payment. If you froze their bank statements on day one, you could not tell them apart. The only difference, the only variable in this whole experiment, is what happens when something catches their eye online. On the surface, this looks like the easiest comparison in personal finance history. Dana sees a countertop ice maker at 11 p.m., the kind that makes the nugget ice, and orders it before she's even finished thinking about it. 2 days later, it's a set of wireless earbuds. The week after that, a weighted blanket, a standing desk converter, a skincare fridge. Dana's Amazon order history reads like a lifestyle magazine that got run through a shredder. By her own estimate, she spends around $380 a month on things she didn't plan to buy. Mara does something different. Anytime she wants something that isn't a necessity, she puts it on a list, literally, a note on her phone, and doesn't allow herself to buy it until 30 days have passed. If she still wants it after 30 days, she buys it. Most of the time, she says, she forgets why she wanted it in the first place. Mara spends maybe $60 a month on things from that list, because most of the list quietly dies of natural causes. At a glance, this is a landslide. Dana is bleeding $320 more a month than Mara. That's $3,840 a year. And if you stopped the video here, you'd assume Mara is going to retire early while Dana is still working at 70. That's the story everyone expects. It's also not the whole story. And if you only looked at the visible spending, you'd miss the layers that actually decide who ends up ahead. Here's the first thing most people get wrong about this comparison. Saving money and building wealth are not the same action. Mara isn't spending that extra $320 a month, but what is she doing with it? This turns out to matter enormously, because Mara, like a lot of disciplined savers, doesn't invest it. It sits in the same checking account it would have left from, earning essentially 0.01% in interest. Dana's not investing hers either, obviously, since it's gone. But Mara's isn't working for her either, it's just parked. Meanwhile, Dana, for all her impulse buying, has one habit Mara doesn't. Her company offers a 401k match up to 4%, and Dana set hers up on autopilot the day she was hired and never touched it. She contributes 4% of her salary, about $193 a month, automatically, before she ever sees the money, which means her impulse spending happens with what's left over, not with the retirement money. Mara, meanwhile, meant to set up her 401k contribution eventually, and it's been 2 years since. This is hidden layer 1. Discipline in one area of your financial life doesn't automatically transfer to another. Mara's discipline is about restraint. Dana's accidental advantage is about automation. And automation, it turns out, beats restraint almost every time, because automation doesn't require you to remember to be good. Let's go back to Dana's $380 a month for a second, because there's something hiding inside that number. A chunk of Dana's purchases aren't discretionary junk. They're convenient substitutes for things she'd otherwise have to do herself. The $34 grocery delivery upcharge, because she didn't feel like driving to the store. The $22 rush processing fee on a return she could have handled for free if she'd waited 3 extra days. The subscription she forgot to cancel, $14.99 a month for a service she used exactly once. None of this shows up as impulse shopping in her head. It shows up as just this once. But just this once, repeated 52 times a year, is a pattern, not an exception. Here's the number that should make you flinch. Of Dana's $380 a month, research on discretionary e-commerce spending suggests roughly 20 to 30% of it is genuinely frictionless convenience fatigue spending, money spent specifically to avoid a minor inconvenience, not to acquire something she wanted. That's $76 to $114 a month, or up to $1,368 a year, spent purely on the tax of not wanting to think about logistics. Mara doesn't pay this tax because her 30-day rule accidentally filters out convenience purchases along with impulse purchases. But, and this is important, she also doesn't get the convenience. She drives to the store. She waits in line for returns. She spends time instead of money. Which brings us to the layer almost nobody accounts for. Mara's 30-day rule isn't free. It costs her something Dana doesn't spend nearly as much of: time and mental energy. Every item on Mara's list requires her to write it down, revisit it, reevaluate it, and eventually decide against it. And that decision-making has to happen dozens of times a month. If you estimate that each item takes even 5 minutes of active reconsideration across its 30-day life, thinking about it, checking the list, weighing it again, and Mara adds roughly 15 new items to her list a month, that's 75 minutes a month, almost 15 hours a year, spent specifically managing the desire rather than the money. This isn't a criticism of Mara's system. It's one of the best documented and most effective ones in personal finance. But time has a price too. And if Mara's hourly rate at her job works out to roughly $34 an hour after adjusting for benefits, those 15 hours represent about $510 a year in cognitive labor that Dana simply doesn't pay. Because Dana's system is see it, want it, get it, instant, thoughtless, and comparatively effortless. So far, the score is closer than it looked at first glance. Dana loses roughly $2,472 a year net of her automated 401k advantage and the frictionless purchase estimate. Mara gains that gap back, but effectively spends around $510 a year in time cost that never shows up on a bank statement. Neither one is winning cleanly yet. Here's where it starts to separate. Let's talk about the ice maker. Dana bought it, used it 4 times. It's now under a folding table in a closet. This is where the real hidden cost of impulse spending lies, not in the purchase price, but in what economists call sunk utility. Money spent on an asset that stops delivering value almost immediately, but that Dana still has to store, still occasionally feels guilty about, and this is the part people miss. Still sometimes replaces with a better version of the same thing later, because the first one wasn't quite right. Across a year, Dana makes about 46 impulse purchases. A reasonable estimate, based on typical unused goods data, is that 30 to 40% of impulse buys are used fewer than 5 times before being abandoned. If a third of Dana's $380 monthly average, about $126, goes toward things that get essentially zero ongoing use. That's $15–12 a year that isn't just spent, it's spent for close to nothing. Not for enjoyment, not for utility, for a 5-minute dopamine spike and then a spot in a closet. This is different from hidden layer 22's convenience tax. Convenience purchases at least deliver the convenience they promise. This category delivers almost nothing at all. It's the purest form of value destruction in Dana's entire spending pattern, and it's also, critically, the layer most within her control, because it's not solving a real problem the way the convenience purchases were. Here's a layer that cuts against the Mara, is obviously winning narrative, and it's the one most videos like this skip entirely. Dana's impulse buying, chaotic as it is, keeps her engaged with upgrading her actual daily life. Her desk setup improved. Her skincare routine improved. Small, real quality of life gains, purchased inefficiently, but purchased. Mara's 30-day rule is so effective at killing desire that she's now gone nearly 3 years without replacing a mattress that's visibly sagging, because every time she puts it on the list, she talks herself out of it by month 25, then it falls off her radar entirely. The system built to stop bad purchases has started stopping some good ones too. This is a subtle but real cost. Over-filtering. If your friction is high enough to kill impulse spending, it may also be high enough to kill maintenance spending, health spending, and quality of life spending that genuinely pays for itself. A new mattress, for context, runs $800 to $1,200, and sleep quality affects everything from work performance to grocery bills, since poor sleep correlates with more impulse eating and more convenient spending. Mara's frugality may be quietly generating small offsetting costs elsewhere in her life that never get logged as cost of the 30-day rule, because they show up in a completely different category months later. Neither system is clean. Dana's is bleeding money on stuff she doesn't need. Mara's is occasionally underspending on stuff she does need. The real question then isn't who spends more. It's who compounds better over 10 years once you count all 5 layers together. Let's run the tally. This is the part that actually decides the outcome, and it's the one layer that gets more powerful every single year. What happens when Dana's automated 401k money and Mara's static savings account both get exposed to time? Year 1, Dana has contributed $2,316 to her 401k, her 4%, plus the employer match effectively doubling a portion of it. Call the total account contribution about $3,700 including the match. Invested in a target date fund, averaging roughly 7% annual growth. Her balance, after year 1 growth, sits around $3,830. Her checking account, thanks to impulse spending, has grown by only about $340 for the year. Mara, meanwhile, has $3,840 more in her checking account than Dana from not impulse spending, but it's earned about 34 cents in interest all year. Her total extra cash, roughly $3,874. Mara is still ahead by about $8,000 total when you count both of their balances plus starting savings. Nobody's shocked yet. If you paused the story here and asked 100 people who were winning, all 100 would say Mara, and for good reason. The gap looks decisive. Year 2, Dana's 401k has grown to about $7,900 with a second year of contributions layering on top of the first year's growth. Her checking account has barely moved, still absorbing the impulse spending. Mara's cash pile, now 2 years of that $320-ish monthly surplus deep, sits around $9,600. The gap has actually widened slightly to roughly $9,700 in Mara's favor, because Dana's account is still small enough that compounding hasn't started doing meaningful work yet. 2 years in, contributions matter more than growth. Year 3, Dana's 401k, now with 3 years of contributions and market growth, sits around $12,600. Mara has continued not investing. Her checking account has swelled to roughly $14,600 in accumulated unspent Dana money, still earning next to nothing. Dana is closing the gap, but Mara is still comfortably ahead by about $2,000, mostly because Dana's convenience purchase and unused impulse item losses. Hidden layers 2 and 4 are still actively working against her. Year 4, Dana's 401k crosses $17,300. Mara's checking account total climbs to roughly $20,000. The absolute gap looks similar to the year before, but the shape of the two lines has changed. Dana's curve is visibly bending upward now, while Mara's is still a straight line. If you graphed both trajectories side by side, this is the year an attentive viewer would start to suspect where things are headed, even though Mara is still numerically ahead by close to $2,700. Year 5. This is the pivot point. Dana's 401k has crossed roughly $22,400, boosted by 5 years of 7% average compounding, and the employer match effectively being free money. She never had to earn twice. Mara's stagnant cash pile has reached about $25,500. Dana is now within about $3,100 of catching up, and for the first time, Dana's trajectory is steeper than Mara's, because compounding is exponential, and Mara's pile is only growing linearly. Year 6, Dana's 401k, approximately $27,700. Mara's cash total, approximately $29,900. Gap, about $2,200. Closing fast. Notice what's happening here. Dana's yearly gain between year 5 and year 6 was larger than her entire balance after year 2. That's what compounding actually looks like once an account has enough time and enough money in it to start generating real growth on its own. Year 7, Dana, approximately $33,400. Mara, approximately $34,200. Gap, about $800. At this point, the two are close enough that a single strong or weak market month could flip the order temporarily, but the underlying trend line is no longer in question. Year 8, Dana, approximately $39,600. Mara, approximately $38,500. For the first time, Dana is ahead by roughly $1,100, purely because retirement account growth has finally out-compounded a savings account with no growth engine. This is the moment, if this were a real graph on screen, where the two lines cross for good. Year 9, Dana, approximately $46,300. Mara, approximately $42,700. Gap, about $3,600 in Dana's favor, and widening at an accelerating pace, because every additional year of compounding is now working on a larger and larger base. Year 10, Dana's 401k balance, approximately $53,600. Mara's static, uninvested cash total, approximately $46,900. Dana is ahead by roughly $6,700, despite having spent, over 10 years, tens of thousands of dollars more on ice makers, skincare fridges, and rush shipping fees than Mara ever did. And the gap isn't slowing down. Project one more decade at the same rates, and Dana's compounding advantage doesn't just persist, it multiplies, because a bigger base growing at the same rate produces a bigger dollar gain every single year that passes. Say that part again, because it's the whole point of this video. Dana spent more, impulsively, thoughtlessly, and often on things she barely used, and she still ends up richer after a decade, purely because one small automated decision on her first day of work outperformed 10 years of manual discipline sitting in a non-interest-bearing account. Here's the obvious question, and it's worth answering directly instead of dodging it. What if Mara had done everything she already does? The 30-day rule, the restraint, the discipline, and simply put her surplus into an index fund instead of leaving it in check? Run the same 10 years with Mara's $320-ish monthly surplus, invested at that same 7% average return instead of sitting idle, and the outcome flips completely. Her balance after 10 years would be roughly $55,800, not because her behavior changed at all, but because the destination of the money changed. She'd beat Dana by about $2,200, restoring her original advantage, and this version of Mara would be, without question, in the strongest position of anyone in this comparison. This isn't a knock on the 30-day rule, it's proof that the rule was never the deciding factor. The deciding factor every single time, was whether the saved or spent difference got invested at all. It would be dishonest to present this as impulse spending secretly wins, so let's be fair to Mara's side, because there are real, legitimate downsides to Dana's approach that the 10-year numbers don't fully capture. First, Dana's outcome only works because of a single lucky structural decision: the automatic 401k enrollment that she didn't consciously choose so much as fail to opt out of. If her employer hadn't offered a match, or if she'd turned off the auto-enrollment like plenty of new hires do, her 10-year number collapses back toward her checking account growth alone, which would leave her tens of thousands of dollars behind Mara. Dana's win is fragile and largely accidental. Mara's discipline, by contrast, is a skill she actively builds and controls, and skills transfer to new situations, new jobs, new emergencies, new goals, in ways that lucky defaults don't. Second, Dana has no emergency cushion. Her $3,000 starting savings barely moved in 10 years because impulse spending ate into what should have been cushion building. If Dana loses her job, has a medical emergency, or faces an unexpected repair, she has almost no liquid buffer, while her wealth is locked in a retirement account with real penalties for early withdrawal. Mara, even in the version where she never invests a cent, has a much larger, fully liquid cash position that she can access instantly with zero penalty. In a genuine emergency, Mara is safer, even if she's poorer on a 10-year chart. Third, and this is worth sitting with, Dana's habit is stressful in a way her bank balance doesn't capture. Impulse spending is linked, in a lot of behavioral research, to anxiety and regret cycles that erode quality of life, even when the math eventually works out. Mara sleeps better about money, even if her mattress is bad. Fourth, there's a compounding risk on Dana's side that the 10-year numbers don't show because it simply didn't happen in this particular version of the story. Impulse spending has a tendency to escalate, not stay flat. Dana's $380 a month at 29 could easily become $500 or $600 a month by 35, especially as her income rises and her impulse purchases scale up with it. A bigger salary buys a nicer version of the same bad habit. Mara's discipline, on the other hand, tends to be durable precisely because it's rule-based rather than willpower-based. A 30-day rule doesn't get harder to follow as your paycheck grows, but an impulse habit often gets easier to justify. If Dana's spending crept upward even modestly over the decade, it could easily cancel out her entire 401k advantage, which means her win in this comparison depends on her impulse habit staying exactly as contained as it is in year one, a fragile assumption on top of an already fragile advantage. Fifth, Mara's system produces a second-order benefit that's almost impossible to put a dollar figure on: financial confidence. People who successfully practice restraint for years tend to make better decisions in every other financial category too: negotiating salaries, evaluating major purchases like cars and homes, and avoiding predatory financial products. Dana's account balance might technically be higher in this specific 10-year window, but Mara's underlying financial skill set is the kind that compounds across her entire life, not just inside one retirement account. You might be thinking, this whole comparison hinges on Dana getting lucky with a 401k match. That's not a fair fight. That's a completely reasonable objection, and it deserves a direct answer, not a dodge. You're right that the match specifically is doing a lot of work here. But the underlying principle isn't about matches. It's about automation removing the need for willpower. If you strip out the employer match entirely and just look at Dana's straight 4% automatic contribution, growing at 7%, her 10-year balance would be roughly $33,900 instead of $53,600. Still meaningfully ahead of Mara's non-invested $46,900. No, actually behind it by about $13,000. So the match specifically matters. Without it, this comparison flips back toward Mara hard. The lesson isn't impulse spenders win, it's automated investing. Even modest and even lucky beats manual discipline that never gets invested. Remove either the automation or the market exposure from Dana's side, and Mara wins comfortably every single time. The second objection you might raise: what about inflation? Doesn't that erase some of this? It's a fair catch. Over 10 years at a typical 3% average inflation rate, both of their dollar totals lose real purchasing power, but they lose it at the same rate. Since we're comparing two people in the same economy over the same decade, Dana's $53,600 and Mara's $46,900 both shrink in real terms by roughly the same 25 to 26%, which means the gap between them, that $6,700 difference, stays proportionally intact. Inflation changes what the numbers can buy. It doesn't change who's ahead. Before we land on a takeaway, it's worth checking whether Dana and Mara's story is a fluke, a one-off quirk of one lucky 401k match, or whether the same pattern shows up somewhere else. So let's look at a second pair, because if the lesson only works once, it's not really a lesson. Meet Priya and Colin, same age as Dana and Mara, 31 this time, same rough income bracket at $61,000, same city, different building entirely, and they've never met either of the other two. Priya is what you'd call a subscription grazer. She signs up for trials, forgets to cancel half of them, and layers new streaming services, meal kits, and app subscriptions on top of old ones she never quite gets around to trimming. By her own accounting, she's paying for 11 active subscriptions, only 6 of which she uses in a given month. Colin, meanwhile, runs a strict cash envelope system, physical envelopes labeled entertainment, dining, misc. And once an envelope is empty, spending in that category stops until next month. No exceptions, no borrowing from another envelope. On the surface, this looks like the same story as Dana and Mara, just with a different flavor of leak. Priya's dead subscriptions cost her about $61 a month in pure waste, money for services she isn't using at all, not even inefficiently, just not using. Colin's envelopes are airtight. He almost never overspends a category, and his discretionary spending sits reliably around $40 a month below Priya's. But here's where the pattern repeats, in an interesting way. Colin's cash envelope system works entirely in physical cash, which means the money he saves relative to Priya sits in his sock drawer, not in a bank account, not invested, earning nothing, and slowly losing value to inflation every single year it's not deposited anywhere. Priya, on the other hand, works for a company that automatically escalates her 401k contribution by 1% every year she gets a raise, a feature she signed up for once, 3 years ago, and has never touched since. She doesn't manage it. She barely remembers it exists. It just quietly increases in the background. Run this pair out 10 years, using the same 7% average market assumption, and something familiar happens. In year 1, Colin's cash envelope savings put him about $480 ahead of Priya. By year 4, the gap narrows to under $100 as Priya's auto-escalating contributions compound. By year 6, Priya is ahead, and by year 10, Priya's retirement account sits around $31,200 compared to Colin's sock drawer total of roughly $23,800, a gap of more than $7,000. Even though Colin was, by every conventional measure, the more disciplined and careful spender of the two. Two completely different behavioral profiles. An impulsive online shopper against a rule follower, and a scatterbrained subscriber against a disciplined envelope budgeter. And the same underlying mechanism decides both outcomes. It's never about who spends less in the moment. It's about which dollars, saved or spent, eventually get exposed to growth, and which ones just sit still. Discipline earns you a bigger pile. Automation and market exposure decide whether that pile actually grows or just ages. Doesn't this just mean I should stop budgeting and start investing instead? No, and this is worth being precise about, because it's an easy thing to misread. Budgeting and restraint are what generate the surplus in the first place. Without Mara's or Colin's discipline, there's no extra money to invest at all. The point isn't that discipline doesn't matter, it's that discipline alone has a ceiling, and that ceiling is whatever a non-interest-bearing account can offer you, which in practice is close to nothing. Discipline gets you the fuel. Automation and investing are the engine. You need both, not one instead of the other. What if the market drops right before year 10? Doesn't that wreck Dana's and Priya's numbers? This is a fair and common objection, and the honest answer is yes. Sequence of returns risk is real. A downturn in year 9 or 10 could shrink Dana's or Priya's balance meaningfully in the short term. But two things soften this. First, the 7% figure used throughout this video is already a long-run average that accounts for both good and bad years blended together, not a promise of steady growth. Second, and more importantly, both Dana and Priya are still accumulating, not withdrawing. A temporary dip in year 9 doesn't erase a decade of contributions and compounding, it just delays some of the gains, and historically, a diversified account given enough additional time recovers and continues compounding afterward. The comparison holds up over long horizons specifically because it's not built on any single year's performance. What if someone genuinely can't afford to contribute anything, even 4%? This is the most important objection of all, and it deserves honesty rather than a tidy answer. If rent, groceries, and essentials are already consuming the full paycheck, there is no surplus to automate, and no video about compounding interest changes that reality. In that situation, the actual first move isn't Dana's 4% or Mara's 30-day rule. It's addressing the gap between income and essential expenses directly, whether through negotiating pay, cutting a major fixed cost like housing, or picking up additional income. This video's lesson applies once there's a surplus to direct. It doesn't manufacture a surplus that isn't there. So what do you actually do with this? Not be more like Dana, and not be more like Mara, because both of them are only half a strategy. Take Mara's restraint and put it inside Dana's automation. That's the entire lesson in one sentence. If you have any kind of employer match sitting unclaimed right now, that is the single highest return decision available to you, full stop, and it will outperform almost any amount of manual willpower you apply to your checking account. And if you already have Mara's discipline, if you're already someone who can resist the 11 p.m. ice maker, the only thing standing between you and a dramatically better decade isn't more restraint, it's redirecting the money you're already not spending into something that grows. You don't need to become a stricter version of yourself. You need to become a slightly more automated version of yourself. Concretely, that means three things in order of how much friction they actually require. First, check whether your employer offers any kind of match on retirement contributions, and if you're not already capturing it, that's the single highest leverage move available to you this week. It requires one form and no ongoing willpower at all. Second, if you're already someone with Mara's or Colin's brand of discipline, redirect the money you're not spending into an account that grows, instead of letting it accumulate somewhere that pays you nothing for holding it. Third, if you're more like Dana or Priya, don't try to become a different person overnight. Set up one automated transfer or one auto-escalating contribution and let the system do the restraining for you. Since systems don't get tired, don't rationalize, and don't have a bad week that turns into a bad decade. None of this requires becoming someone you're not. It just requires making sure that whatever pattern you already have, whether it looks more like an ice maker at 11 p.m. or a sticky note on your monitor, eventually routes through something that compounds. So think about your own last 10 purchases. Not the big ones, the small ones, the ones you barely remember clicking buy on. Add them up. Now ask yourself the only question that actually matters here. Is that money just sitting somewhere, or is it working for you? Because that's the difference between Dana and Mara, and in 10 years, it might be the entire difference in your own bank account too.